Hello everyone! As you have seen in the opening and on this slide, I'm Dian Safitri will explain about wild and isolated children and the critical age issue for language learning. There are 5 tables of contents. What is wild and isolated children? Several cases of wild and isolated children. Critical age for first language learning. Main factors govern language learning. And the last, is there a critical age for first language learning? Okay, first let's talk about what is wild and isolated children. Isolated children are also known as wild children. They were human children who had lived isolated from human contact from a very young age. They have little or no experience of human care, affection, social behavior, or human language. There are 6 cases of wild and isolated children. First, Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron. Victor was a French wild child who was discovered at about 11 years old. When found, he was in a state and didn't make a sound other than the croaking of animals. Ithard began to give Victor an education starting with teaching speaking by involving various games and activities. He tries to get Victor to repeat some words and speech sounds and has to learn where the speech sounds come from before he can associate these sounds with language. Until finally, Victor is able to distinguish speech sound from other sounds in the environment. But for 5 years, Ithard tried to teach Victor to speak. His efforts failed. After teaching speaking, Ithard continued his reading and writing program. In this phase, Victor learns to match the color and shapes, then match the image with the object it represents. Then he started teaching Victor the letters of the alphabet using cards. In less than a year, Ithard was able to issue a report stating that Victor's sense, memory, and attention were intact. He had the ability to compare and judge, and he could read and write to a certain extent. The next case is Jenny, raised in isolation. Jenny was discovered in the early 1970s in the Los Angeles area of California when he was 13 years old. At the time of discovery, Jenny was in poor condition and appeared to have no language. In contrast to Victor, she displays some ability to understand and even imitate, or albeit poorly, some individual words such as mother, rat, and bunny. After about a year had passed, Jenny was re-evaluated for her language skills, and the result showed that Jenny's ability to understand speech had improved quite a lot, even though her progress in producing speech had been very slow and continued to slow. Jenny studied the language for about 8 years and made little progress in both comprehension and production, but it was still far below normal and her speech continued to be grammatical. The next is Isabel, confinement with a mute mother. Isabel, a pseudonym, is a child locked up with her mute mother. The mother ran away with Isabel, who was then 6.5 years old. It was then that Isabel's case came to the attention of the authorities. This led to Isabel being admitted to a children's hospital in Columbus, Ohio in November 1938. Isabel's development began in just 1 week when she did her first vocal. Then, less than 3 months after she was admitted to the hospital, Isabel was able to say, "That's my baby, open your eyes, I don't know, that's funny," and so on. After a year in the hospital, Isabel could listen intently as a story was read to her. Isabel had grown from her first word to long sentences and intelligent questions. The fourth case is Chelsea, began to learn language. Chelsea, a pseudonym, only started learning language at the age of 32. At birth, Chelsea's family thought she was deaf. When she was 32 years old, when her hearing was properly tested, it was found that she was not totally deaf but only partially hearing impaired. Through teaching language, Chelsea has developed an extensive vocabulary, but the syntax doesn't seem to have word order, like the small the hat, Richard eat peppers hot, orange steam car in, banana the eat, the boat sits water on, and so on. The next is Helen Keller, the renowned deaf and blind girl. The case of Helen Keller, which occurred in the range of 1880 until 1969, was a case of language deficiency which occurred due to illness, deafness, and blindness at the age of 19 months. Helen learned language with Sullivan Massey through the sense of touch and later even learned to speak. Helen's success in language learning was influenced by the relatively brief encounter she had with speech in her infancy. This shows that language exposure before illness has benefits in language learning. And the last case is Oksana and Edik, raised by dogs. Oksana, a girl who was born healthy who was found living in a dog kennel in the garden behind the family house in a town in Ukraine. After 5 years of living with dogs, Oksana was found behaving and moving on all fours like a dog. After living in a mental hospital and age 19, she could speak in simple sentences, but she had difficulty relating to other people. In 1999, a similar case was found in Ukraine. A 4-year-old boy named Edik who lives in empty apartment with a stray dog to survive. 2 years after his discovery, Edik is living in an orphanage. His language and grammar skills improved slowly, but his social skill remained impaired. At 6 years old, he spoke like 3 years old. The answer is because without exposure to language, children do not acquire the language. Children need some form of exposure which is shown in the form of speech, signs, writing, and touch. Therefore, before language learning can occur, this exposure must be given as early as possible in a child's life. Our next explanation is main factors govern language learning. After reviewing these cases, we can identify two main factors that might have influenced their different success in learning the language. This relates to language exposure and levels of non-linguistic trauma. The first one is the age at which language exposure begins, and the second is level of physical, psychological, and social trauma before language exposure. In this case, Victor was unable to achieve full competence or success in spoken and written language because there is no information. Why doesn't Jenny develop more than him? Jenny has significant speech comprehension. This is the following of explanation. Okay, finally we come to the last explanation, and this is a big question. Is there a critical age for first language learning? The most important point in these cases is the fact that Isabel and Helen began learning language at an early age, between the age of 6 and 7. By contrast, Victor and Jenny were almost twice as old at 14 and could not learn as many languages as Helen and Isabel. From these cases, it can be concluded that there is a critical age for first language learning. The younger the child is exposed to language, the easier it will be for him to learn and acquire language. I think that's all for me. Thank you for watching and listening. See you!